I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up on the next episode of The Trade Guys, we'll talk BRICS Summit, G20, and U.S. manufacturing, all on the next episode of The Trade Guys. Trade Guys, we're back. And the first thing I want to talk about today is the BRICS ambition for De-Dollarization. The BRICS hosted their annual meeting last week in Russia with the addition of its newest states, Egypt, UAE, Ethiopia, and Iran. On the table was the issue of de-dollarization. First, I want to ask you guys, what is de-dollarization? I'm assuming it's making the world not dependent on dollars or the dollar not the currency of the world, but there's probably a lot more to it than that. And why are some of the BRICS Plus, I guess we call them now, BRICS Plus nations calling for it? Is that why Bill's been hoarding gold?
My son has been hoarding gold, but I'm not.
Bill, what is your take on de-dollarization?
Well, I think the rationale for it in the beginning was what Scott said at the end, which was sanctions avoidance. If you're not doing your transactions in dollars, you're not really in the US banking system. And it enables you to avoid many of the sanctions that we've imposed on banks and other financial institutions. That was the rationale. And I think there are, as Scott said, I barely admire him for getting all the way through paragraph 65 of the agreement. That must have been mind numbing. But they're trying to come up with alternatives. They have limited options. Scott has dismissed most of them. I think gold is going to turn out to be a more popular option, particularly in the BRICS. It's flatlined recently, but they've gone from 5% of world gold holdings in 2008 to 22% of world gold holdings in 2021. So they've been buying up gold. It is sort of the ultimate, at least perceived, safe investment. It's there, it's metallic, it's tangible. And, it's historic. It's like going back 3,000 years. But, everybody went off the gold standard in the early 70s. I'm not sure how useful it is as a medium of exchange. It's useful as a reserve currency. But the other alternative, which is to go to the RMB or the Chinese yuan, is limited. And the main reason it's limited is because it's not fully convertible. I mean, when countries or companies want to hold their money someplace, they want to put it in a currency where they know that it's safe, that it's not going to be devalued in the short run, and where they can get their money back when they need it. And with China, you don't know if you can get it back. I don't see that changing because for the Chinese state, this is a control issue. It's not just an economic issue. They have capital controls, and they're concerned about not having capital controls because if they don't have capital controls, they're probably going to see capital flight because a lot of Chinese that have money are going to move it out of the country and put it somewhere else that they think is safer. And China doesn't want that to happen. So I foresee gradual de-dollarization simply because, the world's getting more complicated. There are more alternatives, and you'll see efforts here and there to use alternative currencies in specific cases for specific transactions. The other reason I think it won't go anywhere is inherent in the nature of BRICS itself. When it was really dominated by Russia, China in particular, and India to a lesser degree, Russia and China had a huge incentive to de-dollarize because they were primary sanctions victims. The others are not, and they're not quite as ready to disassociate themselves from the West as clearly Russia is and as China seems to be. And the additional new members they're talking about bringing in are in that category as well. These are countries that don't want to be labeled as anti-West. The BRICS rationale, increasingly, particularly if you listen to the Chinese, is let's construct a system that is non-Western. Let's construct an alternative to the Western U.S. rules-based trading system. If they want to do that, they can do that. I think some of the countries that are joining BRICS, or they're already in it, Brazil and India being two good examples, I don't think they want to do that. They don't want to be outside the Western trading system. They do substantial trade with the West, and they want to do more. So I think it's self-limiting. I can see why Russia and China want to do what they want to do, but I'm not sure they're going to get support even within their own structure.
So if they were successful, though, what specific sectors of the economy would be most effective? Guys, let's move on to the G20 Trade and Investment Ministers meeting. Last Thursday on October 24th, trade and finance ministers gathered in Brasilia where they endorsed a set of principles that will be voted on and is expected to be adopted as an annex to Leaders' Declaration after the summit. G20, of course, is made up of 19 countries who represent 85% of the world's GDP, more than 75% of the world's trade, and two-thirds of the global population. So let's talk about it. What were the outcomes of this meeting?
Well, like a lot of these meetings, there weren't necessarily specific measurable outcomes at the moment, particularly because it's a minister's agreement and all they're doing really is sending things on to the leaders for when they meet.
Well, was it a useful meeting this time?
Well, yes. I mean, let's begin with the concept. And one of the reasons why I thought we ought to say a word about the G20 is because we just spent 12 minutes or whatever it was on the BRICS, which are basically the point of the BRICS is to try to create an alternative to the Western trading system. The G20, even though it includes BRICS members, is more focused on how do we sustain and reform the rules-based trading system, not how do we dump it and create something else. And so a lot of the discussion was about how to make things better. So the main topics this last time in Brasilia were sustainable development, which, everybody is for until you start talking about how expensive it is. Women's participation in trade, which makes eminent good sense, though I think you can probably find some men in some countries that don't think that's a very good idea. And investment facilitation as a pillar for more inclusive economic growth. That's what they focused on. And they developed a compendium of good practices on women's participation in trade and developed some guidelines and principles for sustainable trade and for investment facilitation. They also emphasized, which I thought was interesting, that the principles include the quote, sovereign right to regulate, unquote, and to implement sustainable social and environmental measures. A lot of this tracks the Biden-Harris trade policy. Let's not talk about market access. Let's not talk about tariffs. Let's talk about sustainability. Let's talk about the environment. Let's talk about worker rights. Let's talk about things like that. And this is, a little bit of that. And it's the kind of thing where it's hard to be against it. And it's pretty easy to support principles that say it's a good thing. But taking concrete steps to achieve it is something different. And by and large, what they agreed to is not in the concrete steps area. They did focus a good bit of time, as I said, going back on their interest in sustaining and reforming the system. And they spent a good bit of time talking about WTO reform, which is an issue near and dear to my heart. And it happens to be the 30th anniversary of the WTO, which was agreed to in 1994 in the Marrakesh Agreement, which I think the actual anniversary of that day apparently was during the G20 meeting. And so the G20 reaffirmed their commitment to WTO reform. And in particular, what that means, and here they got a little bit more practical, a fully operational dispute settlement system by the end of 2024, which is not a new goal. That was the same goal that the WTO 13th Ministerial agreed to in February. So they're just repeating what they had already said they were going to do. But it's a reminder that they've made very little progress toward that in the intervening 9 months. And it precipitated the same argument in Brasilia that's been going on in Geneva and elsewhere. I mean, there's a lot of different reforms on the table, but the big one that it kind of devolves into is what to do about the appellate body, which is defunct thanks to the United States' refusal to allow the organization to appoint new members to the appellate body as the old members' terms expired. So there are now no members. So we are in a situation where panels can make decisions, but countries can avoid the consequences of losing by announcing they intend to appeal the decision because they haven't lost the right to do that under the WTO rules. There's just no place to appeal to. So what happens is called appealing into the void because the appeal goes on the books, nothing happens, and the sinners can keep on sinning. And for the United States, it's been convenient to be in that situation because we've been sinning a good bit lately and have lost a number of WTO cases. And not having an appellate body basically allows us to keep on doing what we've been doing without being made accountable for it. So the United States and Brasilia repeated their view that they support WTO reform, they support settlement reform, but they do not necessarily agree that there needs to be an appellate body, that there needs to be a two-level settlement process. The United States so far has not really put forward a comprehensive statement of what it wants, but it has made occasional statements about what it doesn't want. And it seems to not be too excited about going back to a two-level process, which most of the other countries want. So that's a point of contention that is supposed to be resolved between now and the end of the year, and we'll see. The other thing, and then I'll stop, is that they also commented on the IFDA, which is the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement. This is an agreement that's not on rules on investment, but designed simply to facilitate investment. It's what's called the Joint Statement Initiative in the WTO, which means it was a coalition of the willing, not all 166 members, but just those that wanted to do it. But in this case, it was quite a number. I believe it was 121, or at least more than 120, who signed on to this and agreed to abide by its rules and principles. But the issue was joined in the ministerial in February when there was an attempt to take that agreement and embed it into the body of WTO rules and make it another, like the government procurement agreement or the information technology agreement, part of the WTO. And India and South Africa objected to that, to the chagrin of the 120 plus countries, including many developing countries that had signed it. And the developing countries signed it because they thought it would make investment in their countries easier. So they're not pleased with the Indians and South Africans, which is an interesting development. Those two countries opposed it because they maintain that any agreement in the WTO has to be multilateral. That is, it has to include all 166 members. And they have not participated in negotiations that include less than that, the JSIs, of which there are several. And they have objected to efforts to include JSI outcomes into the WTO rules. So people are frustrated with the Indians. The Indians' objection is sort of pragmatic because if you can only have multilateral agreements that involve everybody, then India can block all of it because they're one of everybody. This is an effort, basically, the JSIs are basically an effort to get around the countries that always block things. So you can see how this is going to play out. This will be an issue in the WTO reform case as well. The fact that the Indians have consistently been blocking larger agreements has led us toward joint statement initiatives in the first place. And now they're trying to block those. This is one reason why the WTO is losing credibility and people are losing enthusiasm for it. I had thought that plurilateral approaches, which are joint statement initiatives, would be kind of a pathway out of this mess. But the Indians seem determined to block that pathway as well. But we'll see how it goes. The G20 made a fairly anodyne statement on it, but it's lurking out there, and we're going to have to get to it sooner or later.
Guys, we got a few minutes left, and we can't get through this podcast without talking about the fact that according to the Peterson Institute, our buddies over there, the U.S. is undergoing a manufacturing renaissance. What does this new analysis from the Peterson Institute tell us about U.S. manufacturing?
Well, it doesn't tell us as much as you just made it sound.
Well, so I'm one of those sinners you were talking about a few minutes ago. I apologize for my sin, but I feel like this is one of these issues we could do an entire episode on.
We could, and maybe we should, because there's more data to be gathered on this. Robert Lawrence, who is an old friend and a distinguished professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and a longtime observer and writer on trade issues, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, has produced a new study that focuses primarily on manufacturing employment, which is really only half the issue. The other issue is output. But he focuses on manufacturing employment, and what he finds is that there's less there than one would think. Little evidence of a renaissance in manufacturing employment as of last July. That, in fact, what's happened in recent years is that because of COVID, there was a sharp drop in manufacturing employment in 2020. They lost 1,370,000 jobs, all due to COVID during that period. By the middle of this year, we were marginally ahead of where we were in 2019. So we were only a little bit ahead of employment in 2019. We had made up the loss of 2020, but we were sort of back to where we were before. And he contrasts that with, if you look at the broader growth in non-agriculture employment, i.e. not just manufacturing, but everything else aside from agriculture, those jobs increased 5.8%. So what that means is that manufacturing as a whole, in terms of jobs, has continued to decline, and its output has flatlined a little bit too, which is what I want to get to in a minute. He also concludes that productivity growth has leveled off as well, that between 2017 and 2022, which I guess is the latest year available, total factor productivity in manufacturing grew by less than 0.1%. And labor productivity, in specific in manufacturing, fell by 2% between 2017 and 2024. And in contrast, productivity in the business sector at large grew by 12.7%. So basically what he concludes is that manufacturing is lagging in efficiency and competitiveness. Now, the interesting thing about that is that you have to look not just, though, at that, but the other side of the equation, which is output. And what I've said for years is that we're manufacturing as much stuff as we ever did, but we're doing it with a lot fewer workers. And I think that's generally true. If you look at long-term manufacturing data, what you've seen is growth in manufacturing output throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and right up to 2008. You had a pretty clear, straightforward, significant growth curve right up to 2008 in terms of output. Sharp drop in the recession of '08. Partial recovery in '09 and '10, and then leveling off, sharp drop in COVID, like I was just talking about, and then a return basically to where we were in 2015 or 16. And no significant gains since then. In other words, trajectory of output increases has flattened, manufacturing is stable, and employment has leveled off as well. And the consequence of that is it's becoming a less significant part of our total economy. We are mostly a services economy. And of course, that leads to, I can't resist, one of the ironies of the current election campaign, because people are now, both candidates are spending a huge amount of time talking about manufacturing and manufacturing jobs, which right now are less than 8% of our total employment. And what they should be doing is talking about the 75% plus employment that is in the services sector. That's where all the votes are. That's where all the people are. And that's not what they're talking about.
Guys, this has been great as always. We will be back next week for more of the Trade Guys. To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.